When all this happened, I was between jobs. A friend helped by selling some higher-end cameras and gear to me for cheap. I planned to resell them for more, but found it difficult. All the offers were too low, so I kept the gear to do jobs with. I worked a wedding or two and found them far too stressful. Just as I was getting desperate, I saw a job request sitting in my junk folder. Someone wanted me to film segments for their new YouTube channel, investigating urban legends. The first job would be walking around in the middle of the woods. I hated hiking. I hated camping. And I hated hanging out in the forest. I replied to the email and gave them a ridiculous price for my time. I expected to never hear from them again. Then they agreed. I assumed they were talking a big game just to get me on board, but I was paid half up front. Even if I got stiffed for the rest, the payment I already received was enough for me to do the job. At least it paid my rent for the month. If I played my cards right, I might have some sort of steady income until the money on their end dried up. That's how I found myself unpacking a bunch of expensive cameras at the start of a hiking trail, and meeting 6 new people. 2 of them introduced themselves as the main faces of the channel. Chris was young and blonde, maybe around 19, with a phone in his hand at all times. He told me his last name and paused, expecting a reaction. It turned out his family was well off, so this side project was just something to keep him busy. Instead of buying luxury cars with his father's money, he put it into a YouTube channel, focusing on his niche interests. If he wasn't so damn annoying, I would have liked him as a person. His friend Connor was tall and thin. He appeared as if he didn't want to be there, and most of his comments sounded forced, like he needed to reply to Chris every time he spoke. I was introduced to the rest of the cast, but I didn't remember their names. There were 2 girls fresh out of a college art course, making plans and discussing how to line up shots. 2 guys stood by carrying bags of things I didn't think we would need for a day trip into the woods. We stopped at the ranger's office first for an interview. I was thankful to get out of the muggy air. The girls took forever to get the camera in the right spot. I swear we moved that tripod around 10 times, and they kept adjusting items in the back of the shot. Who cared if there were 4 books on the table behind the ranger instead of 3? We finally were able to start the interview. 2 rangers were working, but the older of the 2 refused to be on camera. "Can you tell us about any odd experiences you've had working here?" Chris started. Connor fidgeted, and Chris shot him a look. "Oh, forgive my friend here. He doesn't believe in any of this stuff," Chris said, and it made the entire room stiff and awkward. Connor looked just bored. He didn't care if the stories he would hear were true or not. A year or so ago, I watched a few videos of a popular ghost hunting pair on YouTube. One believed in ghosts, and the other didn't. They had good chemistry, making the videos entertaining to watch. Chris and Connor had none of that. Chris was just using his money to copy that channel without understanding what made it work. Just having a tall host who didn't believe in the supernatural wasn't enough to become successful. "Well," the ranger started when the tension passed a little, "there's the normal stuff people report. Odd sounds in the woods, eyes watching him in the dark. But compared to other big forests like this one, we don't have too many local legends." Chris appeared disappointed, and he didn't hide it. "I mean, there are some rumors of creatures in the woods, right?" he pressed. "Lately, people near the forest have had reports of things getting stolen from their yard. A few said they saw a pale person rushing back into the woods at night. The cops think it's just someone on drugs stealing whatever isn't nailed down to try and sell for their habit. Other than that, everything else can be explained by city people confusing animals at night for something else." Chris opened his mouth to say something, but the ranger went on. "Don't you think that's a bit weird, though? That there's nothing odd about this forest? I mean, everywhere has some sort of Bigfoot sightings or something along those lines. The fact that this place is so damn normal is freaky in its own way." The room fell silent. That wasn't what Chris wanted to hear. At least, not at first. Slowly, a grin came over his face as a conspiracy brewed away in his head. He suddenly thanked the ranger and started to get us wrapped up. I found it a bit odd, but didn't question it. The plan for the rest of the day was to get shots of Chris and Connor talking in the woods about the topic of the video. But what was the topic? This place was normal. I didn't think going after some backwoods addict would be interesting enough to get views. "Yo, there's totally a cover-up happening," Chris said, his face flushed with excitement. I rolled my eyes. He didn't notice. I watched the other two guys take out a drone to look it over. Once we got on the hiking trail, the trees would be too dense for them to get the shots they wanted. They were so focused on their task that they weren't paying attention to Chris. A cover-up for what exactly? Connor asked, sounding honestly curious. Chris made me start filming and then nodded at Connor to ask his question again so his answer would be in the video. Maybe it's for a cult. It's just too odd for this place to have no urban legends. The local town is large enough for a school, and a school means kids. Have you ever heard of a bunch of kids not making up stories to scare each other? Chris spoke as we walked down the trail. I had a hard time keeping the camera steady on the path. Sweat started to form on my forehead from the humid summer air. I was glad we were in the shade of the trees. Again, for what reason? Connor questioned. I don't know, a cult? We all raised our eyebrows at him. I like the light here, let's stop for a bit, one of the girls said. For the next hour, we stopped and started again down the trail, being directed by the girls trying to catch the best angle for Chris's ramblings. He bounced from cults to police cover-ups, to even a secret government base hidden deep in the trees. For some reason, Connor wasn't fully against the crazy ideas his friend was saying. The pair went back and forth discussing how such things were possible. I did my job following along, praying we wouldn't be here for much longer. We didn't meet anyone else on the trail. I saw someone off in the distance using a large walking stick. They didn't slow down or turn around to tell us to quiet down, they just kept hiking. The longer we walked, the hotter we got. A hint of an odd smell was carried on the breeze. The smell grew, and the others took notice. It was a rotten and yet almost sweet scent. Do you think a deer died near here? One of the girls asked. I panned my camera around, looking on the small screen. A white shape caught my eye, and I zoomed in. My breath hitched as I realized what the source of that smell was. It's not a deer, I said in a low voice. They all froze, concern on their faces. The forest grew dead silent aside from the breeze through the trees. Not even a bird sang. Oddly enough, I wondered if I'd heard any birds since we entered the woods. Hey, I started looking at the two guys. Ben? He said with a nod. Right. Ben, can you get the drone through the trees? He and his friend, Pete, I think, silently went to work. None of us wanted to admit out loud what we were expecting to see. Saying it would make the situation far too real. Why don't we just walk over? Maybe they need help, the girls offered. We don't want to disturb the scene, Pete said, already knowing what was a few feet away. So very carefully, they got the small drone up in the air in between the branches. Chris hovered to look over our shoulders at the shaking image on the screen. I didn't want to see this, and yet I felt oddly compelled. Soon, a white shape came into view. Only half of it was visible. At first, we assumed the bottom half of the body had been buried. The horrible truth became clear when the drone got closer. We had found the body of someone who had their bottom half either cut off or eaten by some animal. The breeze stopped, so only the sounds came from the drone. It wasn't just the fact that we found a body in that state. No, the body itself looked odd. The skin was a pale grayish hue. The man was missing his lips and eyelids. I squinted at the screen, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. His ears and teeth appeared far too pointed to be human. Let's go back, I said in a heavy voice. Everyone agreed. We marked the area where we stood with some string, then started back down the trail. We tied a string to trees so it would be easier for the rangers and the police to follow the route we took. The ranger we spoke with before had been outside the office building. He knew we had seen something based on our expressions. He waited until someone finally spoke up. I told him the basic rundown, knowing no one else wanted to say it. Shortly after, a pair of officers arrived. We told our story yet again and handed over the drone footage. I offered what I had on my camera, but they weren't interested. I found that very odd. So did Chris, but for once he didn't say anything. Chris dismissed us for the day. I didn't admit it to the others, but I was scared as hell in those woods. Even before we found the body, the air inside those trees gave me the creeps. I showered off those feelings the moment I got home. I then started to upload the footage to my computer to send it off to Chris and be done with this whole ordeal. For a few days, I thought I would never be back near those woods. My phone rang, and it was either my landlord saying the rent was overdue or a scam call. I groaned, seeing it was neither of those things. "Hey, are you busy this weekend? I want to go back to Birdsong Park," Chris said on the other end. "Yeah, I'm booked up, but why would you want to go back there? Aside from some crackheads, there isn't anything going on in those woods," I said, only half believing my own words. "There's something weird about that place. I contacted the police about what we found, and they gave me nothing. I have connections. They can't even find a case file." I sighed, getting ready to try to talk him down. They're small-town cops. They either have a slow, old computer system or do everything on paper. Hell, they might not be the best at their job. I bet they've never dealt with a murder before. The most they've needed to handle are troublesome kids or a farmer getting too close to his sheep. Chris snorted out a laugh at my last comment, which made me warm up to him a little bit. I think if he wasn't so weird, we could have been friends. "Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It all feels so off. Listen, I might sound off the wall sometimes, but I don't believe anything without proof. I have a gut feeling there's something to find there. Me and the guys are going camping and poking around this weekend. Come along. I'll pay you. You don't even need to hang out with us." I chewed on the inside of my cheek, debating on my answer. I hated camping. I hated the outside. And I felt a little bad that Chris knew I didn't want to be around him. "I'm not sure. I'm really busy," I lied. "How much do you need?" "It's 2 to 3 days of work. What, like $3,000? He offered as if that was nothing. My phone slipped a little from my hand as my mouth fell open. That would take care of my rent problem for a hot minute. I recovered and laughed at the crazy amount he just offered. "I'm more of a $3,000 per night type of gal," I joked. "Okay, so 9 for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday?" he asked, totally serious. I put my hand over the phone so he didn't hear my suppressed scream. How did this guy still have money? Wasn't he making it too easy for people to take advantage of him? Fine, I can ditch my plans for that much. But I'll only accept the money if I give you something. I'm not saying I'll find proof some monster ate that guy we found, but I'll at least film some footage for your channel while I'm there and write up reports. Stuff like that. This way I wouldn't feel so bad taking his money. I was going to be a very overpaid assistant for a channel that didn't even have a video up yet. Even after being offered such a large sum of money for basically just camping, I dreaded going back into those woods. Chris was right. There was something strange going on my logical brain couldn't understand. That Friday, I arrived at the ranger's office again. This time, alone. Chris and the guys were already in the woods picking out their campsite. Despite the nice weather, I didn't see any other cars in the parking lot. I went inside the office to get checked in and to talk to the ranger, to see if there had been any updates in the half-body case. He didn't seem shocked to see me. The old ranger took one look and made an excuse he was going to the washroom, so his partner was left alone in the room with me. "Sorry to bother you again, Ranger. Daniel," he told me, and held out a hand over the wooden counter for me to shake. At least he didn't seem to dislike us for simply poking around. "Do they know what happened to that person we found? We haven't heard anything about it." He shrugged, not thinking finding a half-body in the woods was such a big deal. "Person got lost, died of exposure. Animals ate what they wanted. Case closed." I raised an eyebrow at how easily he blew off my concerns. "Have they identified who he was?" He shook his head, saying I would need to bring that up to the police. He was answering my questions, but in a way, I thought he wasn't actually giving me any answers. Our conversation felt different than how he spoke with Chris during the interview. The office door opened and Daniel's expression changed. An emotionless mask came over his face as if he was frightened of something and wanted to hide it. I turned my head to look at the newcomer. He was around my age. Despite the summer heat, he wore a large, baggy gray sweater. A tall walking stick was in his hand. It had some twisting branches on top, making it appear more like a fantasy staff. Each step was planned as he made his way over to the counter. His eyes remained directed towards the back wall of the office, as if he wasn't even aware I was there. "How are you today, Daniel? I've heard some new campers are setting up this weekend." He spoke in a soft voice I bet would make girls swoon. He paused to lean an ear towards me and then slightly turned his head. "Is someone new here with us?" I noticed his pale eyes and awkwardly realized he was blind. "I'm friends with those campers," I explained. He nodded and turned his head back towards the ranger. "Here, I washed them." The newcomer placed a basket with plastic Tupperware on the counter. Daniel swiftly bent down and placed a new basket on the wooden surface for the man to take. It was covered by a cloth, so I didn't see what was inside. "Do you live in town?" I asked the man. Again, he directed his ear toward me instead of his eyes. It was a bit weird speaking with someone who didn't make eye contact. "I live in the woods just down the trail. I pay the rangers to go into town to get goods for me," he explained. If it was that simple, then why did Daniel seem so nervous around this man? The fact he lived in the woods caught my attention. He may be able to tell me more about the area, and I could earn the money Chris was dumping into my lap. The newcomer took a step forward, and I asked him to wait. "Can I walk with you?" I asked. He smiled at the suggestion and agreed. I requested to carry his basket, finding it heavier than expected. I then offered him my arm to hold onto as he walked. I wasn't sure if that was insulting or not. If he lived in these woods for a while, he wouldn't need a guide. But I always walked with my grandmother, holding her elbow after she lost her eyesight. Thankfully, he wasn't offended and placed a hand on my arm. "Have my friends been bothering you at all?" I questioned when we started on the trail. I was having issues walking on the uneven ground. For the rougher patches, he acted more like a guide than I did. "No, I just heard them once when they passed by. I don't think they even noticed my cabin," he replied, carefully walking around the larger rocks in the dirt trail. At least those guys aren't acting like a nuisance to the locals. For now. Silence came between us. I found it hard to think of a way to start questioning about the forest without being rude. "They're gonna get eaten alive out here," he suddenly said. I stumbled in the dirt, my heart jumping into my throat. His calm voice saying such an intense statement made my skin crawl. "What do you mean?" I slowly asked. He tilted his head slightly towards me, his eyes staring elsewhere. "It's the reason no one camps around here. We got a lot of rain, so hundreds of small temporary ponds form. That means heavy mosquito activity." "What did you think I meant?" The last part was in a playful tone. I frowned, knowing he couldn't see it. He got me for a second there. "We were the ones who found the body. It was missing the bottom half, so I thought you were talking about some sort of rabid animal." His pace slowed a little. He felt a little bad for bringing up a terrible topic. "I don't think we ever introduced ourselves," he stated. "Oh, I'm Lee," I responded, and hesitated saying my full name. He sensed it and gave a few extra seconds, waiting for it. When I didn't keep talking, he spoke again. "I go by Nikhil." I looked him over, trying to place where the name came from. Honestly, I didn't know much about other people's cultures aside from the basic things. It's not as if I didn't respect others. I just wasn't exposed enough to be aware of things outside my community. His skin was dark, but his hair was a bright light blonde that was almost white. I swore to look up the name when I got home. "Now that we're friends, do you want to talk about what you saw? I bet it was a little bit frightening." It wasn't the shift in mood. I had been losing sleep over what we found, but I wouldn't admit that to anyone. Well, anyone besides him, it seemed. Yeah, it was a bit freaky. I don't believe in the extreme things Chris does, but after being in these woods and finding that body, all just doesn't feel right. Body didn't look natural. I trailed off, suddenly realizing it wasn't in the best taste to say all this to someone who lived out here. "Do these woods scare you?" "Not at all." Nikhil shook his head. That made me feel a little bit better. If he's lived here without any issues, then maybe what was happening was just a passing experience. I noticed him move his head as if he heard something off in the distance. I listened as well, expecting to hear Chris and the others. Or anything at all. "It's still a 10-minute walk to my place. Do you have somewhere else to be?" We had stopped in front of a footpath, just big enough for 2 people to walk through. I glanced over my shoulder, considering if I should find where the others had camped. I didn't plan on staying the night. I wanted to only camp tomorrow night to avoid being on the grounds for 2 nights in a row. "I can see you to your door." Was that a poor choice of words? If so, Nikhil didn't appear to mind. We kept going, talking a little bit more. The breeze picked up, cooling my sweaty forehead. Then a distant rumble of thunder came. I looked at the sky through the trees to see it was still blue. We arrived at his small cabin carved out in a space in the middle of the woods. It was made of sturdy logs. Piles of chopped wood leaned against the side, with a rusty axe stuck into a stump. It looked like any respectable small cabin should, aside from the solar panels on top, that didn't match the cozy cabin aesthetic. "It's going to rain soon. You should stay here until it clears up," Nikhil said after he opened the door and invited me inside. I shook my head, then remembered he couldn't see me. "If I walk fast, I should make it. Can I borrow an umbrella just in case?" He picked up one from inside and offered it. I thanked him and said I would leave it at the ranger's office for him to pick up later. He wished me luck and I started back off down the trail. I quickly found out that the rain there was no joke. The storm rolled in fast. The wind picked up and shook the trees so hard it seemed like they would fall over. The umbrella was useless in such powerful winds. The rain came down in such large drops it became impossible to see. I didn't know how long of a walk it would take to reach the office. I couldn't see the trail in front of my own feet. This wasn't good. Without any choice, I needed to turn back. Nikhil knew where I would end up. He had a towel and a change of dry clothing ready for me the moment I got inside. "This storm is insane," I sputtered out. "Yes, they can be. Are your friends safe?" I frantically took out my dripping wet phone. To my dismay, it refused to turn on. "You wouldn't happen to have any rice in that basket?" I asked. "No, just human flesh offerings," he shrugged. He kept his tone too even when he made jokes. It freaked me out. When I didn't laugh, he shook his head. "I'm fresh out of rice. I should have asked for some, but I was craving something else." He walked over to the table where he put the basket and pulled out a clear plastic bag with some hunks of bloody meat inside. "It sounds gross, but I love cow tongue. Oh, and I have some pig trotters, too." "Trotters?" I asked. He raised his hands in front of him and mimicked little hooved feet walking. "You know, trotters." I couldn't hold back my laughter. Then I jumped when a burst of thunder shook the cabin. If the storm got stronger, it would do serious damage. I was lucky I turned back when I did. Nikhil offered to make a hot meal, but I refused, already feeling bad enough that I crashed at his place. Even though I knew he couldn't see, I got changed into dry clothing inside the cramped bathroom. The cabin had a main room, a bathroom, and a small door set into the floor, which I assumed to be a storage space. There weren't many sitting options, so I sat at the edge of his bed looking outside at the raging storm. Were the guys doing okay in this? Maybe they made it back to the ranger's office. Trees bent under the winds and heavy rain. It was almost too dark to see outside aside from the flashes of light. Nikhil cooked his dinner and it warmed the small room. He had picked up an iPad to start an audiobook while he cooked. It felt oddly cozy being in a stranger's place. I refused food, and yet he placed a plate with a sandwich next to me after he had eaten. For a while, I forgot the reason why I was even there. It really felt as if nothing strange ever happened in Birdsong Park. Hours passed, and the storm started to let up a little. "I should get going," I offered. "It's still raining and dark out. You should stay the night." I frowned, feeling conflicted. I didn't want to overstay my welcome, but I also didn't want to put on my wet and cold shoes to get back to my car. Plus, I would need to get a hotel in town. And I've seen those hotels. A cabin in the middle of the woods would be a cleaner place to stay. I should at least get to the office and check on Chris and the others. "Do you have a flashlight?" I mentally kicked myself after I asked. Why would a blind man own a flashlight? Oddly enough, he nodded, and opened the small door to slip under the floor to his storage space. He tossed up a heavy-duty camping backpack that had been stained with dirt. He opened it and dumped out the contents. My face flushed when women's undergarments landed on the top of the clothing pile. Why would he have a bag that clearly didn't belong to him? "Does this lantern work?" he asked, holding up a battery-powered hand lantern. I tested it, thinking about the best way to ask about the bag. "Sometimes people leave stuff behind, because they either don't want to carry it or just forget. I store things like this for the Rangers," he explained, shoving the clothing back inside. I didn't think anyone would leave their full bag either on purpose or because they forgot. But that train of thought was derailed when he picked up a pair of black underwear and paused. "These are kinda too sexy for a camping trip. Was she trying to romance Bigfoot or something?" he said, and teasingly lifted them near me. I laughed again and pushed his hand away. We had been listening to a crime drama as we waited out the storm. I bet he had spicier audiobooks on that iPad. A sudden knocking at the door made my heart jump into my chest. Nikhil abandoned the clothing to rush to the door for 2 people to pile inside. "Chris! Connor!" I rushed over to them. They were wide-eyed and soaking wet. Connor had a long, bleeding scratch over his face, and his shirt had been ripped at the bottom, as if someone had grabbed and pulled hard on it. Chris held on tightly to a small metal baseball bat he had brought along on their camping trip for some sort of protection. Nikhil was able to guide Connor to sit down, and got to work finding a first aid kit. Chris was sputtering, unable to get a full thought out. "The guys, they're still... I need to go." He turned on his heels and rushed back outside. I followed behind him, lantern in hand. I shouted to him to come back. He either didn't hear me or refused to listen. I grabbed the axe by the firewood and chased after my friend, ignoring that now Nikhil called out to us to wait until it stopped raining. The storm died down to a slight drizzle. I was soaked a few minutes into going into the woods. I soon realized what kind of mistake I just made. I didn't see the light of the cabin or any signs of Chris. My dumb actions just got me lost in the woods, and now I wasn't helping anyone. I yelled for Chris or anyone to tell me where they were. A voice in the distance echoed through the trees. "Help!" I bolted towards the sound of Chris in trouble, my feet slipping on the wet ground. I followed his voice through the dark trees, getting hit with branches on the way. Soon I came to a clearing with a person sitting beside a tree. Lifting the lantern, I squinted in the dark, trying to get a better view of them. "Chris?" I asked, breathing hard. The person turned their head toward me. Their pale, white eyes reflected the light back. I gasped because they looked like the corpses we'd found. The same gray skin and pointed teeth. The body was dressed in piles of rags, and the smell hit me. It let out a screech and charged in my direction, teeth and claws ready to rip open my flesh. My arm acted on its own. The axe came down into the creature's skull. The body collapsed, twitching to the ground as thick, black blood flowed from the wound. I stood in shock at what just happened, not believing my eyes. Then fear washed over me as I wondered how many more of these things waited in the dark. I heard voices again and debated on whether it was a trap or not. This creature clearly used Chris's voice to get me over there. It took some effort, but I took the axe from the monster's skull to go towards the voices. I hoped it wasn't a trap, and if it was, I could fight my way out of it. Thankfully, I saw someone human. Ranger Daniel and Chris were standing on a trail. The ranger was trying to get Chris to calm down and come back with him. "Chris, are you alright?" I asked him in a breathless voice. "Ben and Peter's still out here. Those things. We ran, but they still could be alright," he gasped on the verge of a panic attack. "I'll look for them, but you need to get back to the cabin. It'll be safe there, and it's closer to the office. I can't find your friends and deal with you at the same time," Daniel said. Chris looked away, ashamed of himself. Not only did he drag his friends into the woods, he couldn't help them. "I'll take him back," I offered. "Give us a gun. You have 2, Chris demanded from the ranger. Daniel gave us a hard look. "Hold out your right hand," he told us. We listened. Chris wasn't able to keep his hand steady while mine was. I was just as scared as he looked, but my body didn't react in the same way. I wondered if I had been able to act this calm in the past, if I would have gotten fired from my previous job and ended up here. The ranger handed me a pistol, ensuring the safety was on. He made a promise of finding the 2 lost campers and ordered us back to the cabin. Chris held the lantern so I could have a hand ready to draw the borrowed pistol if needed. "I'm sorry," Chris said, sounding like a child. He shook from fear and the cold rain. It started to come down harder, making me keep wiping water out of my eyes. "I don't blame you. There's no way you could have known this would happen." He shook his head, not accepting my words. "I knew something was wrong about this place, but I still made us come here." We walked in silence for a while. The cabin started to come into view, and Chris calmed down a little. Why did he tell us to come here? Wouldn't going back to the cars and leaving for help be a better idea? He asked as the thought came to him. We both hadn't been thinking clearly until then. Why did he say to go back to the cabin? Surely one of those things could easily break inside. We still knocked on the door and were led inside by a shell-shocked Connor. Man, he said in a whisper. At some point, someone had dragged the other man inside, leaving a trail of rainwater on the floor. Chris collapsed next to his side, nearly hysterical over how bad of shape Ben was in. We all knew he wasn't going to last until help arrived. His body was covered with so many claw and bite marks. He lost far too much blood, and his body temperature had gone way down in the rain. Where's Nikhil? I asked, realizing he wasn't inside. He... Connor started and got too choked up to continue for a moment. He left after you. Brought Ben inside, but those things grabbed him. Connor was blaming himself for not being able to help. However, I didn't fault him for staying inside. One person still living was better than stupidly going after a lost cause. I gritted my teeth, hating my choices. I knew the odds of Nikhil still being alive, and yet... I'm going after them, I said and turned towards the door. They didn't stop me, but both looked at the gun in my waistband. They had weapons like knives inside the cabin, but it didn't feel right to leave them alone without them. I made sure they were aware of how dangerous it was for an inexperienced person to handle a pistol. If we weren't in this kind of situation, I wouldn't have considered it. I told them to treat it as a last resort, and to do their very best not to shoot each other or themselves. I still worried for them. Connor handed over a flashlight that was better than the lantern. I told him if I couldn't find any signs of Nikhil, I was going to go down to the office to call for help. Neither of them had their phones on them, and mine still wasn't working. I doubted Ranger Daniel was good enough to deal with whatever was going on inside this forest. I left the cabin, determined to make sure no one else got hurt that night. There were some drag marks in the mud outside. I followed the path, my stomach sinking when I spotted blood slowly getting washed away by the rain. I had two choices. Keep going down the path to a working phone, or try and find a person I barely knew. I picked the wrong option, swearing I would only go so far and then head back. By some miracle, I didn't find Nikhil, but it was too late. My flashlight cut through the trees, landing on him a few feet away. I opened my mouth to call out to him, but my voice stopped from the fear of seeing pale shapes stalking through the trees. He must have heard my footsteps. His head turned enough for me to see his bloody face. Lee? He asked just before those creatures fell on him. I screamed, unable to reach him in time. Within seconds, at least 10 of those monsters swarmed him, pulling my new friend to the ground. Terrible sounds of bones breaking and flesh ripping came. A few creatures couldn't squeeze into the feeding frenzy, so they turned their attention in my direction. I hated myself at that moment, but I turned to run. Pale, long legs hot on my trail. I heard something almost like a high-pitched bird as creatures screamed behind me. I stopped long enough to bring the axe down on a creature's exposed neck. It fell to the ground as two more turned on it. I kept racing through the woods, stopping just long enough to wound or kill one of my stalkers. If they weren't interested in eating their dead and wounded, I wouldn't have lived for as long as I did. I don't know how long I fought for. I couldn't hold out forever. Just as I thought the numbers started to thin out, 5 more monsters came from the trees. My body ached. My lungs burned, and I felt as if I was going to pass out. I wasn't going to be able to fight off all these creatures. I found a clear pathway through them and booked it through the trees. Suddenly, a large branch came swinging into my face, knocking me off my feet. I should have died then. And yet I woke up being dragged away by 2 of those creatures. I struggled, but they clamped down harder on my arms. The rain had stopped. Blood and mud covered my clothing. My body shook from the cold and fear. I didn't understand why they hadn't just eaten me yet. They dragged me into a large clearing with a roaring fire in the middle. More of those monsters lingered around, eyes reflecting in the low light. The makeshift camp was covered with stolen trash made into nests. We stopped, and I was able to stand up but not get my arms free from those creatures. The tallest of the monsters walked into the light of the campfire, Unlike the other creatures, he looked as if he had human intelligence. An amused expression came over his face as he adjusted a pile of rags made into a headdress. He walked over to us, leaning down so we were eye to eye. "Strong flesh," it spoke in a low, raspy voice. The other creatures joined in, repeating the words like a chant. The sounds died down when the leader spoke again. "Join us. We want strong flesh. We bring you food. Eat the cabin man. Join us." Bile rose in my throat. I shook my head. Long, thin fingers reached up to grab my chin so painfully I thought my jaw would break. "We want us or eaten." He shook my head hard back and forth, as if he found the action funny. I finally pulled away, face throbbing. My eyes darted around trying to figure out what to do. The creatures holding my arms had a grip too strong to get free from. I refused to become a creature like them. There needed to be another option besides death or something far worse. If I was going to die, I might as well take one more of these monsters with me. My face shot out and I lashed my teeth deep into the flesh of the taller monster's throat. It let out a garbled scream, but I refused to let go. The creatures holding me back lessened their grip from shock. I pulled my arms free. The fight between us was a mess of desperation. Thick, vile blood flooded my mouth, making it nearly impossible to keep biting. The threat of death motivated me to keep going. By the end, I found myself standing over the fading body of the leader. Body exhausted and wounded from the night's events. All of those creatures froze, eyes fixed on me. I breathed hard, waiting for them to move. I might be able to kill one more monster, but I couldn't kill them all. "Well?" I asked after spitting out the disgusting blood from my mouth. They started to crawl closer, scared yet starving. One stood, hunger in its eyes. It started to run forward. My body was tense and ready for attack. A sound came like a quick bird song. The creature that had run towards me suddenly collapsed to the ground. Half the body suddenly disappeared into thin air. I was shocked and didn't understand what had happened. "Sorry, I needed to get changed." I slowly turned my head, still not understanding what I was seeing. The person I was positive had been torn apart stood in fresh, clean clothing. He waved and smiled like we were meeting for a pleasant day out. "Nikhil?" I said, unable to act in any other way. The creatures got over their fear and started to move. They turned to flee, also unsure of how one of them was killed. Nikhil's body went limp for a second, as if he was a puppet with its strings cut. He tilted to the side, about to fall to the ground, nothing behind those eyes for a few moments. I heard a sharp whistling sound, and then Nikhil snapped back. When I turned my head to look back at the camp of monsters, my stomach twisted at the sight. The fire had been stomped out. A large indent of some sort of strange foot had destroyed the camp. Embers gave off enough light so I could see the bodies of the creatures. Each appeared as if they had been cut in half. No, bitten in half. "Daniel came to collect your friends. I'm sorry. The one didn't make it and the other was dead before the ranger found him," Nikhil explained as he walked toward me confidently on his feet. I couldn't move. The information refused to seep into my brain. I felt a hand take my own, making a chill shoot directly to my bones. "You're shaking," Nikhil pointed out. I met his eyes. It felt like he could see me. At that moment, I knew he could. His sight was better than a human. Or anything else, for that matter. "What?" I choked out. "Do you want to go back to the office or to the cabin to rest?" I knew he would listen to anything I asked for. But if I went back to the office to see how Chris and Connor were doing, I wouldn't get the answers I needed. "I'll go with you," I said, mouth dry. He nodded and kept my hand in his so he could guide me back through the woods. My legs shook. Fear still shot through my heart at any sound from the woods. Deep down, I wondered if I just agreed to something I could not come back from. We didn't speak the entire way back. Blood stained the wooden cabin floor. Nikhil brought out more backpacks to find another set of clean clothing so I could change into it. I spent a long time in the small washroom, unable to wash away the blood from my hands. No matter how hard I scrubbed, I still saw it. When I came out, the cabin had been cleaned up. A lantern on a table was the only source of light. A pile of blankets had been placed on the floor next to the bed. "You still have a few hours until sunrise. You should get some rest," Nikhil said. He was sitting on the pile of blankets by the bed. I paused, unsure if I could actually sleep that night. "Do you want me to stay outside?" he offered. I shook my head, a little surprised by my own answer. I didn't want to force a blind man out of his own place, even though I knew he wasn't human. There was a small conversation about me sleeping on the floor, but he refused. I didn't press too hard, a bit scared of what he might do if I disagreed. I crawled into bed, feeling like the dead and yet not tired at all. I stared out the window at the clear sky through the trees. We didn't speak for a while when Nikhil's voice cut through the darkness. "Are the stars out tonight?" he asked. "Yes. There's a lot of them," I answered back. Again, we didn't speak as I got ready for the big questions. "The Rangers know about you," I stated. "Yes." He sat up to lean his head against the bed so I could hear him better. "A long time ago I made a deal. So I'm bound to this place. If they give me an offering, I keep this place peaceful, but..." His head moved as if he was looking at me. "I'll tell you a secret. I lied. There is nothing truly binding me to this place." I saw his smile in the darkness. He had been waiting a long time to tell someone that fact. I forced down 1,000 questions to focus on one at a time. "Why here?" I asked. "It's quiet. My hearing is very good. If I'm too close to a city, I can always hear humans going about their lives. And you are very loud creatures. I know at some point that no matter where I go, I'll have to listen to your kind. When that comes, I don't know how long I'll last before I snap and make everything quiet again." I swallowed hard, letting that information sink in. The person next to me was old and powerful. I don't think humans could ever fully understand what was hiding behind his mask. I lay on my back, sweat starting to form on my forehead. "Why did you save me?" I spoke carefully, not certain I wanted the answer. He could have let us all die that night. But also, I knew he heard the storm coming while we walked to the cabin that day. He'd wanted me to stay for some unknown reason. I felt his weight on the bed and my muscles locked in fear. I didn't dare move as he carefully pressed an ear to my chest. "I like the sound," he whispered, listening to my heartbeat. It wasn't just the sound of a racing heart. He loved the sound of fear. My jaw tightened at the realization. Slowly, he moved away to curl up on the floor. We were done talking for the night. I fell asleep for maybe an hour around sunrise. I woke up to Nikhil making egg sandwiches for us to eat on our walk down the trail. The storm had left the air cool and clean. I kept my breakfast down, oddly feeling fine enough to walk beside a monster I had been frightened of the night before. We met Daniel on the trail just before we arrived at the office. Nikhil left, asking that I drop by again. "Thought you weren't coming back," Daniel admitted after Nikhil left. "I got lucky. And he was just lonely," I said with a shake of my head. I wanted to ask him so many things. Like why Nikhil had campers' backpacks. And if there were just cow tongues in the basket from yesterday. I stayed silent, fearing the answers. Connor had gone to the hospital, but Chris stayed behind. He wrapped me in a death grip of a hug when I walked inside the office. I didn't enjoy it and felt awkward, but I didn't pull away. I think he needed a hug from someone. "Now what?" I asked after Chris peeled away. "Nothing. 2 of your friends got lost in the storm and died of the elements before we could find them. Happens all the time, the older ranger said with a shrug. I knew there was a cover-up. I won't stand by it. They were my friends, and it's my fault they're gone. I'll use every last cent I have to expose what happened, Chris said with tears in his eyes, lessening the impact of his speech. He could say those things because he saw the pale monsters in the woods, and not the thing that ate them. A birdsong rang out from outside. Then the office shook as if something large and heavy dropped outside. We all looked out the now darkened window in horror. Beyond it was a creature so massive we only saw one sharp tooth when it opened its mouth to smile. The whistling came again, and the shape disappeared faster than we could blink. Sound crashed outside, and to his credit, Chris raced out the door to see what had just happened. A large tree had been beside the building. Now it was just the trunk with a massive chunk taken out of the branches around it. It looked like something had come down and taken a bite out of the tree line. Some more branches fell to the ground, creating a mess. Chris seemed to understand that there were forces in this world that money couldn't go against. I like that tree, the old ranger sighed. He hadn't even put down his cup of coffee. We wisely decided to leave shortly afterward. I didn't think Chris was in the state to drive, so I offered to take him into town. I'd never seen a person so defeated before. It's not your fault. You need to understand that. There was no way to know what was inside those woods. It was like you came across a tornado or any other force of nature. We should be thankful the 3 of us made it out alive. Chris nodded and got out of the car. He called for someone else to pick him up. I was beyond ready to go home after all this. Hey, I rolled down my car window to call out to him before he left. Nothing odd happens at Birdsong Park, right? He didn't nod for a full minute. If he disagreed with the statement, he risked his life. I wanted to leave it all at that. For the last that I saw of this place to be in the mirror as I drove away. But I was drawn back there a few weeks later. That's a story for a different time. As I drove home, I just kept repeating to myself, there was nothing strange about that place. As if my life depended on it. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGrupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward, and if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.